I was not present at the assembly when Everard Kane, Duke of Marcastle, destroyed Wren Alcott's family in 2 minutes and 40 seconds before 200 witnesses. I was in Shrewsbury attending to a separate matter, a boundary dispute on the Harefield parcel that required my signature before 4 o'clock. But I was told about it that same evening by 3 different people, each of whom had a different opinion of what it meant, and by the time I arrived at Marcastle Park the following morning, it had already hardened into fact. What happened was this. Old Rector Alcott had filed a petition through my office the previous spring, a land grant claim against the Marcastle estate, arising from a 50-year-old document his late father had preserved, which alleged that 7 acres of the Southfield boundary had been surveyed incorrectly in the original duchy grant and belonged, properly, to the Alcott family's glebe. The petition was minor. The claim was small. I had forwarded it to Everard with a note recommending a quiet settlement. The survey discrepancy was real enough, and the cost of disputing it would exceed the value of the land by a factor of 4. Everard had said he would review it. He reviewed it, evidently, at the county assembly in front of everyone who mattered in 3 counties, with the rector's granddaughter standing 12 feet away. I have the account from Margaret Finch, who was there and has never exaggerated anything in her life. Everard rose, apparently in response to a question about the petition from Sir Edmund Rawle, who had heard of it and decided to be amusing at the dinner table, and stated, in his precise, carrying voice, that the Alcott claim was based on a document that had been examined and found to be a later forgery, that no credible survey supported the boundary adjustment, and that the petition would be returned without merit. He said this without looking at the girl. He then sat down and resumed his conversation. The girl, Wren Alcott, 23 years old, the rector's granddaughter and his only family, had come to the assembly that evening at her grandfather's urging. She was standing near the far wall with 2 other women she had been introduced to an hour earlier. She said nothing. She curtsied, apparently to no one in particular, and then she left. Her grandfather withdrew the petition the following week. He died in November, which is a separate grief and not Everard's fault, though I notice that Everard has never asked about him. The Alcott family's claim on those 7 acres ceased to matter to anyone except Wren herself, who had the old man's papers and knew, as I suspect she had always known, that the document was not a forgery. What I did not know, what none of us knew, was that Wren Alcott had come to the same conclusion and decided to do something about it. She arrived at Marcastle's service gate on the 3rd of October, 6 weeks after her grandfather's death, on a morning so gray and cold that the stable yard was entirely empty except for Dowell, my head groom, who was examining a lame rear fetlock on the bay gelding and cursing under his breath. She came on foot, carrying a small case, wearing a coat that had been a man's coat once and had been altered badly. She told Dowell her name was W. Cole, that she had experience with horses, that she worked quietly and expected no special consideration, and that she would take whatever position was available. Dowell, who was short 2 hands after September's dismissals and had a lame gelding and a nervous filly to manage, hired her in approximately 7 minutes. I found out 3 days later, when I came to settle the month's payroll and noticed the new name in the ledger. I want to be honest about what I did, which is nothing. I knew who she was. I had handled her grandfather's petition. I had seen her once or twice in the village, though we had never spoken at length. I recognized the handwriting in the groom's log, precise, educated, the same hand that had copied the petition documents. And I looked at the entry, and I looked at the date, and I closed the ledger and went to find Everard about the Harefield matter instead. I told myself she had come for a position, that the name was a coincidence, that I was a solicitor, not a spy, and it was not my business to surveil the stable yard. I told myself a great many things that autumn. None of them were quite true. What I can say in my own defense is that I watched, and I was careful, and I never believed she meant any harm. From the first week it was clear that W. Cole was extraordinary at her work in ways that had nothing to do with horses, though she was good with horses too, patient and steady in a way that Dowell commented on twice inside a fortnight. But it was the other things. The corrected ledger entries, the reorganized feed schedule that cut the quarterly waste by a third. The way she managed Dowell's temper, which is considerable, by simply not reacting to it, by presenting him, the following morning, with a quiet solution to whatever had agitated him the night before. She had been in the household 2 weeks when she identified the source of the drainage problem in the east stable that had been causing rot in the flooring for 2 seasons. She did not tell anyone she had found it. She simply presented Dowell with a written assessment of the problem and a proposed remedy, and Dowell took it to me, and I took it to Everard's steward, and the repair was ordered. No one connected it to the new groom's hand. No one looked. Except me. And I looked, and I said nothing, because I had begun to understand that what Wren Alcott had come for was something in the house, and not the horses. I was right, of course. She came for the archive. The Marcastle estate archive occupied 3 rooms on the east wing's lower floor, deeds, surveys, correspondence going back to the original duchy grant in 1764. Everard's archivist, a man named Pont, was 68, short-sighted, and deeply suspicious of anyone who expressed interest in the archive, which meant he was deeply suspicious of almost no one, because almost no one expressed interest in it. He was also, crucially, fond of a particular Shropshire bitter that was only served at the inn in the village on Thursday evenings. And Wren Alcott, in her 2nd month at Marcastle, began covering Pont's Thursday evening duties, the locking up of the east wing, the banking of the East Hall fires, in exchange for, as far as I could determine, the man's company at dinner once a week, and a standing offer to carry his heavier reference volumes. She had, I calculated, approximately 90 minutes on Thursday evenings in which she could access the archive unseen. I knew this. I knew it by the middle of November. I said nothing about it to Everard. What I did instead, and I have thought about this a good deal since, was begin to spend more time at the park. My office is in Shrewsbury, and I have rooms there. I have always kept a guest room at Marcastle for the months when the estate business is heaviest, but that autumn I began arriving on Tuesdays rather than Thursdays and staying through to the weekend. I told Everard it was the Harefield parcel, which was not entirely untrue. There was always something with Harefield. The honest accounting is that I wanted to watch. I had known Everard Kane for 22 years. I had watched him be exacting and fair and occasionally wrong in ways that cost other people more than they cost him. I had never, in those 22 years, seen him look at anything the way he began in November to look at his own stable yard. It started with the drainage report. He asked me casually, in the way he asks things when they interest him more than he intends to admit, who had produced it. I told him Dowell had brought it forward. He accepted this and let it go, and 2 days later he was in the stable yard himself, in his good coat and his worst mood, examining the repair work, and he said to Dowell, without looking up from the flooring, "Who wrote the assessment?" Dowell said, "Cole, your grace, new hand." Everard said nothing. He finished examining the repair. He went back into the house. A week later he came down to the stables again, on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was already failing, and the yard was nearly empty. Wren was in the far end of the yard, working the nervous filly on a long rein in the fading gray light, an exercise she had developed herself, I had noticed, that kept the animal calm in a way that 2 previous handlers had failed to manage. I was watching from the gate. Everard came to stand beside me and watched also, for perhaps 4 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Cole." She turned. She was still managing the rein, keeping the filly steady, and she turned just enough to acknowledge him, not fully, not submissively. There was something in the precise angle of it that I recognized, though I could not immediately name what. "How long have you been working long rein on her?" he said. 6 weeks, Your Grace, she said. Her voice was unhurried. She had, I had observed, a particular quality of stillness in her voice, the voice of someone who has practiced removing everything from it that might be used against them. She was unmanageable in October. She was frightened in October, Wren said. She's not unmanageable, she's cautious. There was a silence. The filly moved in a steady arc. Everard watched it. Yes, he said finally, I see that now. He turned and walked back toward the house without another word, and I stood at the gate and let out a breath and thought, well, there it is. The December frost settled over Marcastle in earnest the second week of the month, and with it came the routine of the deepest part of winter, the shortened days, the smoking chimneys, the particular quiet of a great house drawing in on itself. I stayed. I found reasons. The Harefield parcel, the Credon lease renewal, a drainage question on the north field that I stretched, I confess, to 3 separate appointments. What I was watching was something that had no name yet, and perhaps should not have had one. Everard began appearing in the stable yard with a regularity that Dowell noticed and said nothing about, because Dowell was the most discreet man I have ever employed. He came in the early afternoons when the yard was quietest, and he came without announcement. Sometimes he asked Wren practical questions, the filly's progress, the feed adjustment, the state of the east stable's repaired flooring. Sometimes he stood and watched her work in silence for a few minutes and then left without speaking at all. Once, on a particularly cold afternoon in mid-December, I saw him remain at the fence for nearly a quarter of an hour, his breath making slow clouds in the frozen air, while Wren moved through her work with that quality of concentrated quietness that was entirely her own. And I saw him, at one point, lean his forearms on the fence rail in a posture I had never seen Everard Kane adopt in my life, something so easy and unguarded that it startled me. He did not know I was there. He was not performing it. I do not think he knew what he was doing. That is the thing about Everard. He processes information with great efficiency and arrives at conclusions with great certainty, but he does it sequentially, and some conclusions take time to form because he has spent so long being certain he will not make them. He was watching the woman in his stable yard with the whole of his attention, and he had not yet reached the stage of understanding why. She had, I am sure of it. I watched her watch him watch her, on 2 or 3 occasions, that quick, precise reading of the situation that she did so quietly you might miss it, and what I saw in her face was not calculation. It was something more complicated, something that looked very much like grief that had not yet decided what to do with itself. She was still going to the archive on Thursdays. I know this because I followed her once. I am not proud of it, but by December I had understood that whatever she was looking for, she had not found it, and the longer she looked, the longer this situation would remain as it was, and I had begun to think very clearly about what would happen when Everard discovered who she was, and whether the sequence of that discovery mattered enormously. It mattered enormously. I could not have articulated it precisely in December. By January I could. The document she was looking for was the original 1764 Duchy survey, not the corrected survey that Everard had referenced at the Assembly, but the first one, the preliminary survey, which would show the measurement discrepancy before it had been adjusted in the final grant. The adjusted survey was the basis of Everard's dismissal of the petition. The preliminary survey, if it existed, and if it showed what Wren's grandfather had believed it showed, would prove that the adjustment had been made, which was not, on its own, proof of forgery, but was proof that something had been changed, and that the document old Alcott had preserved was not impossible. It was a thin thread. But Wren had followed it 3 counties through grief and winter, and the smell of a stranger's stable, and I did not think she had any intention of letting go of it. She found the document on the 14th of January. I know the date because I was at the park, and because Pont mentioned at breakfast that one of the East Archive boxes had been left open overnight, not damaged, only open, which Pont found distressing on general principle. He mentioned it to me rather than Everard's steward because he knew I handled the archive catalog. I went to look at the box myself. It was the 1760s survey records. The preliminary survey was missing. I sat down in the archive room for a long time, in the cold, and I thought. Then I went to find Everard. I found him in the library, which is where he spent his mornings when the weather was too severe for the estate walk. He was at the long table with his correspondence, and he looked up when I came in, and something in my face must have shown more than I intended, because he set the correspondence down immediately. "Corwin," he said, "what is it?" I said, "There is something I need to tell you. It is a thing I should have told you in October, and the fact that I did not is entirely my own decision, and whatever conclusions you draw from it about my conduct are warranted." He looked at me for a long moment, then he said, "Sit down." I sat down. I told him. I told him about the petition. I told him about the name in the groom's ledger in October. I told him about the Thursday evenings and the archive and Pont's bidder. I told him about the preliminary survey box. I told him all of it methodically in the order it had happened, and I watched his face as I spoke, that controlled, precise face that had been my closest companion for 22 years, and I saw something move through it that I could not fully name. Not anger, not exactly. Something closer to the expression of a man who has just been told that a calculation he was certain of has come out wrong, and who is running the numbers again, and finding that they come out wrong in a different direction entirely. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You said October." "Yes. She has been here since October." "The 3rd, I said. 11 weeks. He stood up from the table and went to the window. He stood there with his back to me for a long time, looking out at the frozen park. I waited. "The drainage assessment," he said. "Yes." "The filly." "Yes." "The ledger corrections." He turned at that. "Pont mentioned to me in November that someone had corrected an entry in the July ledger that had been wrong for 4 months. He assumed it was you." "It was not me." The silence stretched. Outside, the park was white and absolute. A rook crossed the gray sky above the south field. "She came for the preliminary survey," Everard said. "I believe so." "And if it shows what she believes it shows," he stopped. He pressed 2 fingers to his brow briefly. "What I said at the assembly about the document being a forgery was based on the corrected survey," I said. "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Find her." It was not, of his own words, a request. I found her in the east stable as I had expected. It was early afternoon, the time she usually worked the filly. She was at the near wall, examining the repaired flooring with an unhurried attention, running her boot along the join between the old boards and the new ones, testing it. She looked up when I came in. Her face changed. Only slightly. She had too much command of herself for a large change, but slightly. A small, precise recalibration. "The archive box," she said, "not a question." "He has been told," I said. "He would like you to come to the library." She considered this for a moment. Then she crossed to the wall where her coat was hanging, put it on, the badly altered man's coat still, though she had mended it twice in the months I had been watching, and she followed me out of the stable and across the yard and through the house without speaking. I opened the library door for her. She went in. I did not follow. That was her conversation, not mine. But I waited in the hall because I am not a man who walks away from the things he has set in motion. What I know of what happened inside I know partly from Everard's account, given to me that evening, and partly from what I could observe through the brief intervals when the library door was not fully latched, which was entirely by accident and not something I engineered, though I am aware of how that sounds. The preliminary survey was on the library table. Everard had retrieved it from wherever Wren had placed it. She had left it in the archive room, apparently, rather than take it, which tells you something about her. He had spread it beside the corrected survey, and the two documents were side by side when she entered. She stopped when she saw them. He said, "I heard this clearly, close the door." She did. Then there was a silence that I cannot account for, because I could not see them, and the silence told me nothing about where they were standing or what they were doing. It lasted perhaps 20 seconds, which is a long time when you are waiting in a cold hall. He said, "The boundary mark is different." She said, "Yes. In the preliminary survey, the south field peg is 9 feet west of where it appears in the corrected grant." "Yes. That is consistent with your grandfather's document." A pause. "Yes," she said, and something in her voice had changed, not the controlled surface of it which held, but something underneath the surface, something she had been holding for a very long time. He said, "I told 200 people that his document was a forgery." She said nothing. "I said it without looking at you," he said. "I did not look at you once." Still nothing. "W. Cole," he said then. I heard him move footsteps on the library floor, crossing towards something. "How long were you going to stay?" A pause. "Until I found it. And if it had not been there, I would have left," she said, and that would have been an answer of a different kind. A silence. Then Everard said very quietly, "What is your name?" And she said, "You know my name." "I know the name I was told at the assembly," he said. "I want to hear you say it." Another silence. Then Wren Alcott. "Wren," he repeated. Just that. Just her name, in a voice I had never heard Everard use before, careful and full and low, as though it was something he was learning the weight of. I moved away from the door then, because there are limits to what a solicitor should overhear, even one who has earned, perhaps, the right to be curious. What I can tell you is what happened in the hours that followed, which I witnessed in full. Everard came out of the library first. He was composed, he is always composed, but there was something different in his face, something I had not seen there before, or had not seen there in a very long time. He came to me and said, "Corwin, how quickly can you file an amendment to the Alcott petition?" I said the petition was withdrawn. "Then how quickly can a new petition be filed, with the preliminary survey attached, and an acknowledgement from the estate that the original dismissal was based on incomplete evidence?" I said 2 weeks if I prioritize it. He said prioritize it. Then he went back into the library, and I did not see him again until dinner. Wren came out of the library some time later. I was in the East Corridor, reviewing the Harefield papers or appearing to. She passed me in the hall and she stopped, and she looked at me for a moment. "You knew in October," she said. "I did," I said. She considered this. "You said nothing." "I said nothing," I agreed. She looked at me for another moment. I could not tell precisely what she was thinking, which was unusual. I flatter myself that I can generally tell what people are thinking. But Wren Alcott had a quality of containment that was specific to her, a way of arriving at conclusions in private that the world only saw the results of. "Thank you," she said finally, and she walked on. I stood there in the corridor for a moment, feeling slightly unsteady, which is not something I am accustomed to. Then I went back to the Harefield papers. The petition was refiled on the 1st of February. The estate acknowledged the survey discrepancy. The 7 acres were transferred to the Alcott glebe in the 3rd week of March, which was by then academic, since the property passed in any case to Wren, her grandfather having left her everything he had, which was not a great deal except those 7 acres, and the house, and the sense that someone in the world had loved her without reservation. What happened between February and March, between the library and the land transfer, between Everard's careful, altered face and the moment I understood that something had changed in him in a way that would not change back, is not precisely mine to tell. I was present at the edges of it. I watched Everard begin to appear in the east stable again, and then to stop appearing in the east stable because Wren was no longer in the east stable, having moved into the house at Everard's request as something between a guest and a position that no one had quite defined yet. I watched him find reasons to be in the room she occupied. I watched him become, over those weeks, noticeably worse at concealing things he did not wish to conceal, which was new for Everard, and which Dowell and I discussed once briefly in the stable yard, and agreed never to discuss again. I watched Wren also. I watched her come out of her containment slowly, degree by degree, the way a country thaws in early spring, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, precise increments that you notice only in retrospect. She argued with him twice that I saw, about the Northfield drainage and about the organization of the archive catalog, and both arguments were conducted with a brisk, direct intelligence that Everard met not with his usual precision, but with something that looked very much like enjoyment. I watched him, at the end of the second argument, turn away to look out the window with the specific expression of a man, attempting to prevent himself from smiling. I said nothing about any of it. I am a solicitor. Silence is a professional competence. The day of the land transfer was a Wednesday in late March. Everard had asked me to handle it quietly, no assembly, no public occasion, just the documents signed and witnessed and filed. We met in the library, the three of us, and I read the relevant sections aloud and set the papers out, and Everard signed where indicated, and Wren signed where indicated, and I witnessed, and it was done. After I had gathered the papers, Everard said, "Leave us a moment, Corwin." I left them a moment. I went to the east corridor with my papers, and I stood there and listened to the silence from the library, which told me very little except that it was a particular kind of silence, not an empty one. When I came back, Everard was at the window again, that window he had stood at in January, overlooking the frozen park, which was now beginning to green at the edges. And Wren was at the table, and she was looking at him with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not quite a smile. Something that had been a smile and had grown into something larger than a smile, something quieter and more permanent. I set the papers back on the table. Everard said, without turning from the window, "There is a matter I would like your advice on, Corwin." I said, "Of course." Purely as my solicitor. "Of course." He turned. He looked at me with the expression of a man who is about to say something he has been precise and careful about, and is prepared to be precise and careful about indefinitely, but who would prefer, for once, not to have to be. "Is there a legal mechanism," he said, "by which a man may formally apologize for having been catastrophically wrong about a woman in front of 200 people, and then ask her, as a separate matter, and with full acknowledgement that she owes him nothing and has, in fact, already given him rather more than he deserved, whether she might be willing to remain at Marcastle in a capacity that is, somewhat, permanent?" I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at Wren, who had lowered her eyes to the table with great composure, and whose mouth was doing something it was working hard not to do. I said, "I am not aware of a specific legal mechanism." "No," Everard said, "I thought not." He turned back to the window. There was a long pause. Then he said, in a different register entirely, quiet and exact, and without the careful armor he usually carried everywhere, "Wren." She looked up. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong at the assembly, and I was wrong for the months before it when I did not look at the petition carefully enough to find the discrepancy myself. I do not offer you excuses. I offer you the acknowledgement which you deserve and the apology which cannot be adequate but is genuine." A pause. "And I offer you whatever you are willing to take from this, which I recognize may be nothing, and which I will not argue with." She was quiet for a moment. "You called me by my name," she said, "in January in this room." "I remember." "You learned its weight," she said. "In the learning of it." He looked at her steadily. "I did." "Then you know," she said. that I have not forgotten what was done, and you know that I have decided, in full consideration of what was done, that the man who is standing at that window is not the same man who dismissed me without looking, and that this distinction matters to me." Everard said nothing for a moment. His hands, which were usually so precisely still, had moved barely to the edge of the window frame. "I would stay," she said, "if you asked me." "I am asking you," he said. "Then I will stay." I gathered my papers and left the library, because there are limits to what a solicitor should witness, and I had, that day, reached mine. The petition was archived in March, the land transferred, the documents filed, witnessed, complete. What followed is, strictly, none of my professional business, and I have conducted myself accordingly. What I will say, as a private man and not a solicitor, is this. I have known Everard Kane for 22 years, and I have watched him be a precise and exacting and occasionally devastating force in the world, and I have watched him be wrong, not often, but when he was wrong in ways that cost other people greatly. I watched him be wrong about Wren Alcott in front of 200 people, and I said nothing, and I believe now that I was right not to, not because the wrong was acceptable, but because the correction, when it came in the only form that was worth anything. It came from him. It came from him seeing it, naming it, and standing in the library on a January morning with two surveys side by side and understanding what he had done. There is no mechanism for that. You cannot file it. You cannot witness it. It either happens or it does not, and when it does, it is not mine to claim any part of. I went back to Shrewsbury in April. I came to Marcastle in June, as I always do, for the summer estate review. The house was different in a way I could not entirely specify and did not try to. Easier, more inhabited. There was a lamp in the east library window that had not been lit for the 2 years prior to that winter, and it was lit when I arrived in the early evening, and through the glass I could see two figures at the long table. One of them at the correspondence, methodical, precise. One of them at the survey maps that had been, for some reason, brought up from the archive, bent over them with that quality of concentrated quietness that was entirely her own. Neither of them looked up when I arrived. Neither of them needed to. I went to find Dowell and tell him about the Harefield parcel, and I left them to it. They were, I thought, exactly where they had always been going. From the moment she appeared at the service gate on the 3rd of October with a small case and a badly altered coat, and an entirely original understanding of patience. The rest is not mine to tell.